Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of January 17, 2026. As the intro of our program begins with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we honor him in the most radical sense here on Freedom Now KPFK. Los Angeles' official MLK Day Parade is on Monday, January 19th, kicking off at 10 a.m. at Western Avenue and MLK Boulevard, heading west down to Crenshaw Boulevard, and then south to Leimert Park, Africa Town. And so for today's program, we commence with our sister, Luyanda Kaboka, and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Bernadette Ludwig, sociologist and assistant dean of the Macrocosta School of Arts and Sciences at Western Connecticut State University in Danbury, and author of the book Unwelcome Shores, Black Refugees in America. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Joseph Graves Jr., the Mackenzie Scott Endowed Professor of Biology at North Carolina Agriculture and Technical State University, and author of the book Why Black People Die Sooner, What Medicine Gets Wrong About Race and How to Fix It. We'll also hear prison radio commentaries from political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Tsege Mariam Guebru, Bud Powell, Duke Ellington, Melba Liston, John Coltrane, Matt Wilson, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Le colonialisme, le néocolonialisme, le sionisme, l'apartheid, Foster, Ian Smith, Begin, vive la révolution, vive le président Sékou Touré, vive la révolution africaine, vive all revolutionary parties.
Ja Rastafari. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Weekly Calendar for Freedom Now. This calendar is to give life to our ancestors, our revolutionary ancestors, who have given so much to future generations of humanity in the war against the satanic system of slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. January 17th, 1961. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, was assassinated by President Kennedy-sanctioned CIA operation to destabilize the rise of a revolutionary Pan-Africanist party. The movement National Congolese, whose leader, Lumumba, represented the aspirations of the masses of the Congolese in the century-old struggle to throw out the Belgian slave masters. January 17, 1979. The Shah of Iran, a U.S. CIA-installed puppet, was placed by the CIA-backed coup d'etat against Mossadegh, the democratic elected prime minister of Iran in 1954. The Shah's overthrow was led by a mass popular uprising which rejected the U.S. path of capitalist development. January 17, 1942. Muhammad Ali, the most militant professional athlete in the history of the United States, was born. Ali's public stance against racism, class oppression, and the U.S. imperialist wars in Vietnam and in Africa earned him adulation of the masses of oppressed people throughout the world. Ali was a student of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. January 18, 1958. The Lumbee Indians defeated the Ku Klux Klan in a violent battle near Martin, North Carolina. January 20th, 1973. Amilcar Cabral, founder of the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, was assassinated by the Portuguese, their former colonial masters, and the United States CIA. Cabral, another leading Pan-Africanist, was targeted due to his refusal to become a neo-colony of the United States and Europe. Cabral's ideological contribution on class struggle, culture, and revolution has immortalized him among all African freedom fighters worldwide. January 21st, 1924. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the first modern revolutionary socialist state in the world, dies. Leninism becomes a component aspect of Marxist ideology, which fueled revolutionary fervor throughout Europe. It stood in direct contradiction to capitalism and imperialist ideology, thereby providing the USSR with principled support for African, Asian, and Latin American decolonization movements, whereas the United States and all capitalist countries consistently sabotage all democratic movements against colonialism in the Third World. January 22, 1879. The Zulu Empire defeats the British invaders at the Battle of Isandlwana in South Africa, one of the many victories in the war for Mother Africa. January 22, 1800. Nat Turner, upon receiving the word from God, leads African slave rebellions against the Europeans in American plantation slavetocracy. January 22, 1937. Tamara Bangdi, codenamed Tania, was born in Argentina. She joined the Cuban Revolution and became one of Che Guevara's top military commanders. This has been our African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now 90.7 in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and you can contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. For a listing of prior programs and content, please go to kpfk.org, then to Programs, scroll down to Freedom Now. We would like to close this section of our program with a unity chant from Azania, South Africa. So please join us. We will say Amandla, which means power, and your response should be Awetu, which means it is ours. Amandla.
Awetu. Awetu. Awetu.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Bernadette Ludwig, who is Assistant Dean at the School of Arts and Sciences at Western Connecticut State University, and author of the book Unwelcome Shores, Black Refugees in America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Bernadette Ludwig.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for inviting me to talk about my new book.
So why did you produce this book?
This book actually has an interesting evolution story. So I will say when I was an undergrad, where I did a joint degree in social and cultural anthropology, and when I was after my second year, I spent some time in West Africa. So I had a great experience there. And then when I almost completed my studies, I took a job in Atlanta, Georgia, to work with refugees in the Atlanta metro area. And what I noticed is like how the different services were conceived of for different national groups and how refugees were arriving here. And the United States, until most recently, under the current occupant of the White House, basically changed the narrative how the U.S. refugee resettlement program works. I basically had a front row seat in how policies that were being dreamt up in D.C., how they play out on the ground level. So I saw when refugee state coordinators talked about the newly arriving refugees coming here, how the different service providers responded to it. And I also saw what kind of services were provided and what expectations were given or like basically imposed on the newly arrived refugees. Therefore, I also saw firsthand, and this is not going to come it's a surprise to anyone who grew up in the United States, that nationality and the race of refugees really determined how people responded and what kind of services they provided to them, and also what kind of misconceptions they had. As I mentioned in the book, one of the examples was when Liberians, when the discussion about Liberians came up, some of the refugee providers talked about that they speak is very similar to Jamaican patois. I can tell you from personal experience, this is not that is not at all the same. And so I also noticed that a lot of the literature that was available to guide service providers, to guide schools as to providing services, was really predominantly focused on Hispanic immigrants, on Asian refugees, but not so much about African refugees. And so I had worked with refugees and immigrants in Atlanta for several years. At the end, I founded my own nonprofit organization, but I felt I wanted to make a systemic change. And so I applied to grad school, and to not make it too long-winded, when I was literally in the summer before I started grad school in New York, I was looking for a job, and I saw an organization in Staten Island working with Liberian refugees. They had an advert, and I thought to myself, oh, that's too far. I don't want to go there. It's very far to commute from Manhattan or from Queens to go there. However, that stuck in the back of my head because I had set out that I wanted to go to grad school to study the experiences of a particular African refugee group. I had just not nailed it down. And at the end of my first year in grad school, I decided Staten Island is really far, but I'm still going to take that journey. And I studied Liberian refugees. And I will also say that in the first couple of years, I did not necessarily do any interviews. I really spent a lot of time being engaged with local organizations, providing data analysis, volunteer services, or any of those kind of things. So really trying to build a rapport with the community, because there is a sense of over-researched communities, and I really wanted to make sure that I stay true to my word and not exploit refugees and immigrants. Being an immigrant myself, that was really instrumental in how I just conceived of the research and how I wanted to do this. This was a very long answer to your short question. I'm sorry.
And of course, our audience, I'm sure, is familiar with the fact that Liberia in West Africa, 2 centuries ago, the United States began to expel and encourage Black Americans to move to that West African country as settlers. And that raises the related question with regard to their winding up on Staten Island, which is a notoriously conservative borough of New York City. How does that conservatism fit into your narrative, if at all?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I just want to add one other piece to it. So in order to end up in Staten Island or in New York City as a refugee, you need to have family members who can sponsor you, because New York City is such an expensive place that refugees are all settled as anchor cases, meaning that someone sponsors them. And I was also intrigued that tried to understand why would someone end up in this very conservative, it's the only borough where non-Hispanic white Americans make a numerical majority. And so one of the reasons why they ended, so there are multiple reasons, but one of the reasons was this accessible housing. There was also an assumption that the native-born Black American community would be receptive to it. But I would say that living in Staten Island, and as someone who has taught for years in Staten Island, this is not New York City. This is really where like MAGA hats reign supreme. And the experiences, so when you think about a refugee fleeing like really horrendous experiences, you would want to think that they are arriving in a safety, in a safe neighborhood, and in a safe and welcoming environment. And this has not been the case. The first hate crime that happened after President Barack Obama was elected actually happened in Staten Island. And one of the person who was victimized and beaten was somebody of Liberian descent. So living in Staten Island, I would say for many of the Liberian refugees and immigrants who live there, could be described to other conservative areas. It's less likely to be like New York City. They have access to New York City services, but because it's so far removed, that is also very difficult. But living in New York City, many of the respondents, including Black Americans who I've talked, were very adamant that racism, and to quote, is very high on this island.
So give us another snippet about this hate crime wherein a Liberian was victimized.
Sure. So basically, after President Barack Obama was elected, and we can see this today. This is not like, I mean, what's happening in 2025 is obviously the outcome of hatred against continued hatred against Black people in the United States. And so what happened is that apparently, and I can only go by court records, what people have said, a group of white Americans went and they wanted to, were looking for, and they used the N-word to someone that they could beat up. And so they indiscriminately went to look for into a particular Black neighborhood, and they assaulted people. And the reason why I think it is also an important case here is because they did not distinguish whether somebody is Liberian or someone is American. What they were looking for is someone who is Black. And similarly, in the criminal justice system, when the case was brought forward, the Liberian also was identified as African American. So there was not a distinction made that the individual was a refugee or an immigrant, because the person was targeted because of their race and not necessarily because of their immigration status. And there's really also a tenet of my book where I say that for African refugees, race is really the driving factor, how they are received in this country, less so than their nationality.
Now, it's well known, at least in certain circles, that after the Black American migrants began settling in what is now Liberia, there were tensions of a sort with indigenous African groups who pre-existed their arrival, particularly the Creole, K-R-I-O. I understand that with regard to those who are now refugees on Staten Island, they are significantly, if not disproportionately, indigenous Liberian. Is it fair to suggest that once they cross the Atlantic to these shores, that tensions are reduced, if at all, between the indigenous Liberians and the so-called Americo-Liberians?
So I would say this has come in waves. The important factor is also to consider that the majority of indigenous Liberians who arrived here came on refugee status, whereas those American Liberians were much more likely to arrive here earlier because they had connections. So they arrived here on various statuses. Sometimes they were undocumented and they regularized their status at some point later, or they had temporary protective status. So some of the tension that basically also continued, that refugees had access to different services, resources, government benefits. At the same time, because American Liberians were already established in Staten Island, they also continued to some extent, at least at the very beginning, according to indigenous Liberians, to treat them, and this is a quote, like the hinterland people or country people. So there was still somewhat to the same extent, and I would like to compare that to when we think about the Irish and the British people coming here, that the tension to some extent continued to carry over. It is not totally, it did not go away, but I would say over the years it has improved.
What about relations between the Liberian population on Staten Island and the indigenous Black American population? Mostly smooth, bumps in the road?
So I would say there were obviously bumps in the roads, and that's one argument I make in the book, is that when a refugee resettlement, and again, I want to exclude what's currently happening because I'm hoping this is only temporary, but generally, U.S. refugee resettlement, we resettled 80,000 refugees over a year. They don't necessarily engage when neighborhoods are selected where refugees are resettled. The VOLAGs, the refugee resettlement agencies, generally don't engage with the native population who lives there. And in the case of where many of the Liberians were resettled in the Park Hill neighborhood, this was already a very deprived neighborhood. And so what we should think about is here is newcomers coming in. They are eligible for government benefits. People set up services. And native-born Black Americans see that, and they are saying, like, we have been living in the same community and we are not getting these kind of services. I think that's that issue. The other issue is there was a lot of cultural misunderstanding, but I think a lot of it really boils down to being cultural strangers and being forced to live in a resource-deprived neighborhood. What I would say that over time, as they got to know each other, they really also experience the shared experiences, as you also alluded to before, living in Staten Island and having to contend with anti-Black racism really has brought the different groups together. Has it always been smooth? No, but I think that's to be expected. I think it's a wrong expectation that that we assume that there wouldn't be any tensions. There are differences in culture, there are differences in what people perceive as important. And again, I will say that really the biggest issue was that the resources were extremely limited. And so there was a lot of tension around that.
So Staten Island is also well known for having a significant population of Italian Americans. With regard to the Liberians who settled in Staten Island, did they detect any differences between how they were treated by Italian Americans versus Irish Americans or Jewish Americans, or they did not detect any differences at all?
I mean, so Liberians talked about like that's an Italian neighborhood, but not necessarily. It generally was like just the white people, or if you go to the South Shore, we really need to recognize that Staten Island, and this is to your listeners, this is also not news, that cities in the North and the Midwest are the most racially segregated. And so in Staten Island, we have there is an expressway that basically goes through it, and the North Shore is much more ethno-racially diverse than the South Shore. And so what Liberians would talk about is that when they go to the South Shore, they did not necessarily distinguish somebody as being Italian American, but just their encounters with white people in general.
And the encounters were described how?
Mostly as hostile, I would say. So there was a lot of like I focus in my chapter. There's a chapter in my book where I discuss the experiences of discrimination that Liberians have faced in the housing market, trying to buy purchases, being stopped by the police, being stopped on the street, or being harassed on the street. It is the opposite of welcoming. I would say it is like full-fledged like anti-Black racism. Also in malls, that people were followed in the store. There was also like hateful language and racist language written on Black candidates when they were running for city council. Some of them were Liberians. So overall, I would say many of their experiences, another example I would add here, is many of the Liberians, in particular women, have worked as home health aides for people who are older or people who are with disabilities, and many of them talked about having had really racist and discriminatory experiences.
Anything else to add about the possible unique experiences of Liberian women on Staten Island?
Yeah, so the gender aspect I think is actually really interesting. So there are two components to that. Many of the Liberian women, because of war and because of many of them came from rural areas, did not have a lot of formal education. However, they fared a little bit better in the labor market, and that's not going to be, and this was also has been reported by other researchers too. This is not going to come as a surprise because they were able to find and work as caretakers. Whereas those Liberian men had a little bit more education. They were reluctant, not surprisingly, to do work as home health aid workers. But also they experienced a different kind of racism when we think about Black men going into and being home health aides, because most people would, like, unfortunately, most people who are not Black carry a lot of anti-Black racism and would discriminate against Black men being home health aides workers. The other experience I would also add here is so that many of the Liberian men wanted to do their own business. And so one of the examples that some people talked about is that, for example, if a Liberian man drives a cab and the cab, no one is hailing the cab, he's making no money. Whereas the Liberian women, home health aid is always needed. They always made some money. And also, let's not forget, Liberia was also the first country that elected a female president in the continent of Africa. And that also, I would say, has given some boost to Liberian women in terms of leadership and like how they also see themselves in the world.
Finally, Bernadette Ludwig, who is the author of Unwelcome Shores, Black Refugees in America. Do you plan any further work on Liberian refugees at all?
Yes, I'm actually really interested. So I also serve as a country conditions expert for Liberian asylum cases and Liberians who are in detention. So I'm interested in investigating, especially now with what's happening in this country, the experience of Black and particular Liberian asylum seekers and those who are in detention. I will just add very quickly, one of the experiences are that I have had a good number of Liberians who have come here on refugee status are finding themselves in deportation hearings. And they were actually in detention. And I think this is something that has received less attention, but it's something that is extremely horrible if you think about a person who was brought to this country on refugee status because of their experiences, and now they are being sent, quote unquote, back to a country that they haven't been in decades to.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
Return to the colonial mean. As I began contemplating events in search of a subject for the Luxembourg Conference, day broke on the weekend with news of the U.S. kidnapping of Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, removing them from their home and their country. It put me in mind of the Monroe Doctrine and the long, brutal history of U.S. imperialism, when America removed Latin American leaders like chess pieces, only to replace them with compliant puppets, the better to exploit their natural resources. We tend to think of colonialism and imperialism as simply economic systems, ever present, almost natural in their ubiquity. That's because they seem normal to us because of that feature. But there was nothing normal nor natural about either colonialism or imperialism. That's because neither are neutral economic systems. They are systems of extraction and predation. They are also systems of extreme violence to obtain raw materials from the colonies, which are themselves systems of repression designed to steal labor and the life forces of the oppressed. Who can deny that the U.S. has supported, trained, and paid off the most repressive element in Latin American history for over a century to dominate such societies on behalf of the corporate, or should I say capitalist, interests of American business? What is America's interest? It's simple. It's capital. Why did the U.S. invade Venezuela? For its vast oil reserve. That rot about drugs was nothing but a pretext. Remember the weapons of mass destruction that the U.S. used to justify war in Iraq? A pretext. That's because colonialism, neocolonialism, and its adjunct, imperialism, are but systems of predation and systems of repression. They're but systems built on capital acquisition, as in how to get more and more money. And that's just what we see in Venezuela. We're looking at a stick-up, courtesy of the U.S. military. All you need to do is see what you're seeing. To my friends at the Luxembourg Conference, I wish you love, not fear. Hier spreekt Mumia Abu Jamal. Thank you.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
When you first hear about this so-called narco-terrorism arrest in Venezuela, I urge you to think back, if you can, and you probably can research it online. Think of a name, Gary Webb of the Mercury News. This was a journalist in a small, tiny coastal newspaper who broke the story about the CIA running drugs in the black community and other communities in California and across the nation, right? They were importing drugs and using the money to support the Contras, right? In South America, a war against Nicaragua by their neighbors. Think about the lives that were destroyed by those drugs so that the CIA could launch a drug war against Americans in America. Then ask yourself, who are the narco-terrorists and what happened to them? Were they marched into prison? Not yet, and it will never happen. When you hear the government tell you something and you think it's not so, check it out, and 9 times out of 10, you'll find it's not so. Narco-terrorism is just a political pretext to sell the war to frightened, anxious people because you know in your guts, in your heart, in your mind, that the attack on Venezuela was about getting oil. Because the biggest reserves of petroleum on earth are under the soil of Venezuela. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Killing for clickbait. The shocking killing of 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good by a contemptuous ICE agent is a sad but true testament of our times. The nation is riven by conflict on a host of issues, principally the manner of how immigration is actually practiced in the real world, rather than driven by online rhetorics. Good, a mother of 3 children, had just driven her 6-year-old son to school when she returned to volunteer for her neighbors in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who were demonized for their Somalian and or Latino backgrounds. Her actions, driven by caring and community, have too been demonized as leftist, as radical, or as, in the stinging words of the head of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, a domestic terrorist. Family related to Mrs. Good have described her as a Christian, and perhaps her faith moved her to care for her immigrant neighbors. The federal government, now openly in the grips of rightist ideology, sees U.S. citizens as enemies who may be executed if they don't obey their orders. Their position is actually crystal clear. Obey or die, period. Sound familiar? It should, for this was the message radiating from the Third Reich. This is the message of kings to their subjects. This is the message of power to the powerless. But people, thinking people, feeling people, have more power than they realize, for they have the power to say no. That power mattered to Renee Nicole Good. It should still matter to you. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Professor Joseph L. Graves, Jr., Mackenzie Scott Endowed Professor of Biology at North Carolina A&T University, and author of the book, Why Black People Die Sooner, What Medicine Gets Wrong About Race and How to Fix It. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Joseph L. Graves, Jr.
Again, Anthony, thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, the title, I think, says it all, right? Black people in the United States, in other Western European structurally racist societies, have shorter life expectancy than socially dominant people who are usually of European descent. So there's been a historical set of misconceptions about why that is true. And most of those misconceptions reside in the idea that there's something genetically wrong with persons of African descent, people that we call Black, and that in fact, the reason we die and the reason we suffer is because of these innate genetic properties as opposed to the nature of the societies that we live in. And so the purpose of this book is to completely eliminate these set of false ideas about the genetic inferiority of African physiology relative to disease and lifespan, and to lay bare the processes that occur in structurally racist societies that lead to Black people being sicker and dying sooner than persons who are white.
Now, what is structural racism, and how is it oftentimes conflated with genetic difference, or even what is a product of structural racism is ascribed to genetic difference more precisely?
Okay, so let's first talk about racism, because the way most people understand racism is individual acts of bigotry. And so in my last book, prior to this one with Alan Goodman, entitled Racism, Not Race, we spent a great deal of time explaining the difference between individual acts of bigotry and racism versus racism, which is a result of the way the society is structured to have inherent biases against people depending upon their socially defined race. And that has been precisely the way the United States has operated from its inception. The simple fact that the vast majority of people of African descent in the initial 13 colonies were people who were enslaved right away tells you that this society was structured on a racist principle. The idea that people of African descent should be enslaved and literally they said for their own good, that there was something about being enslaved, working for, wealthy white people that somehow made life better for Black people. Now, that persisted throughout the entire history of the United States. So not just during slavery, in which, and let me make this really clear about the economic production of enslaved people in the United States for your listeners. It's been estimated that enslaved people between 1776 to 1865 produced between essentially $18.5 quadrillion of wealth for white slaveholders. That is an incredible amount of money, and that would be in 1978 dollars, 18.5 quadrillion, of which, of course, we Black people never benefited from this. And during that period of enslavement, of course, it made us sick. It made us die sooner than those who enslaved us. And then after slavery ended, we had a brief moment of an attempt to create a racially just society, which occurred during Reconstruction. But Reconstruction was rapidly overthrown by the former slaveholders and their allies. And Jim Crow forms of segregation were reinstituted throughout the former Confederate States, and other forms of racial bigotry were introduced and maintained throughout the former non-slave states. And so after Jim Crow, we went into a period that Michelle Alexander has dubbed the period of mass incarceration, in which disproportionate numbers of persons of African descent end up in the so-called criminal justice system and in prison. And in fact, the ratio as it stands today in 2026 is over 7-1, meaning for every European American in the criminal justice system, there are 7 times as many African Americans in the criminal justice system. And all of these things have health effects. So a society that treats people differently based upon their socially defined race also results in those people having more illness and shorter lifespans. And so that's what this book addresses, how structural racism, which has been the modus operandi of American society from its very start, is maintaining a system in which Black people live less healthy and shorter lives than white people.
So how does genetic difference enter the equation in terms of...
Well, let's start with how much genetic difference there is, because most people are under the false impression that there's a great deal of genetic difference between Africans and Europeans. And in fact, that that idea is absolutely incorrect. If you took any two people chosen at random on the planet, they would share between 99.5 to 99.9% of their genome in common. So there's actually a very small amount of genetic difference between any two people who are not close relatives. Now, on top of that, if we look at the apportionment of genetic variation in our species, the vast majority of genetic diversity that exists on the planet is found on the African continent. And the rest of the populations of the human species are actually subsets of Africans that resulted from the ancient migration of people around the globe. So if we're going to talk about how does genetic difference, account for differences in lifespan, it's a very small amount if we're looking at it from the position of populations. So the genes that Europeans hold, the genes that Africans hold, don't really make a lot of difference in determining their lifespan. And let me make one more point on this. In fact, when we do genome-wide analysis of the number of bad genetic variants found in these two populations, it turns out that Europeans and European Americans have more bad genetic variants than Africans and African Americans do. So if we were going to go on the basis of genetic predictions, it should be Africans and African Americans living longer than Europeans and European Americans, but in fact, we see the exact opposite.
Now, those, if I may, from your school of thought, oftentimes suggest that what is oftentimes ascribed to race could better be described or ascribed to place, for example. And
so again, when we start talking about these social definitions of race, they have a very powerful determinant of where people live. And where you live is a very powerful determinant of the environmental insults that the body takes across its lifetime. So, for example, a person who lives downstream of a coal-fired power plant is going to get more toxic emissions into their lungs in the form of, various carbon compounds as well as various radioactive elements than a person who doesn't live downstream of a coal-fired power plant. So when we look at the distribution of African Americans in the United States and look at, for example, who is exposed to more dangerous air pollution, well, it's African Americans who are exposed to more dangerous air pollution than European Americans are. Furthermore, when we look at the distribution of things like toxic waste dumps, African Americans are more likely to live within 1 kilometer of a toxic waste dump than a European American is. And so there are all sorts of things that are related to the social structure of the society, which then determines, things like what your income is, where you can live, what environmental toxins you're exposed to, whether you have access to healthy, fresh foods, and so on. And all of those things contribute to how long you live. And in the United States, again, because of this history of structural racism, the people who were subordinated by the European population that came to North America, so this includes the indigenous population of North America as well, and the people they enslaved, are the ones who are the most damaged by the society that they set up.
So what is sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease, and how does it fit into your narrative?
Well, the sickle cell genetic variant first evolved in Africa. Now, it is a variant that when an individual has 1 copy of the sickle cell variant and 1 copy of regular hemoglobin variant, actually provides resistance to malaria. Now, this HBS allele, which is the sickle cell variant, spread throughout the globe. Wherever there are high transmission of malaria zones, HBS will be found at higher frequency than would be predicted in the absence of malaria. So this, by the way, includes tropical Africa, parts of tropical Africa, but also includes southern Spain, also includes the Mediterranean, Sicily, Greece, the Saudi Peninsula, and all the way into India. So we find HBS wherever there is high transmission of the disease malaria. Also, within tropical zones, we don't find HBS where there isn't high transmission of malaria. So, for example, in Kenya, people who live in Kenya at high altitudes don't have high frequencies of HBS because the malaria-carrying mosquitoes don't live at those altitudes. But people at low altitudes in Kenya who are exposed to malaria have high frequencies of HBS. In South Africa, the primary genetic variant that provides malaria resistance is the alpha and beta thalassemia, not HBS. So there, you have a different genetic variant which provides resistance to malaria, but those people are Africans too. So the idea that, sickle cell is an African disease is, again, absolutely wrong. It is a genetic variant which provides resistance to malaria, and wherever malaria is found, and that is throughout tropical Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the Saudi Peninsula, in India, wherever sickle cell is found, you will find, wherever malaria is at high transmission, you will find the sickle cell genetic variant.
So what is high blood pressure? How does it impact Black Americans? And what role does it play in your story?
Well, I don't have the actual numbers at what number of blood pressure is considered high. The term is called hypertension. And basically the narrative, or the again, false narrative, was that hypertension or high blood pressure was a genetically determined characteristic of African people. And again, that is absolutely false. In Western Africa, we find very little high blood pressure. And these populations, Western and Central African populations, are ancestral to the African populations in the Western Hemisphere. We find very high blood pressure amongst Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans. Now, if you aren't going to argue, well, this high blood pressure is a result of, again, genetic determinants, that argument also falls flat on its face, because when we look at Europeans and European Americans, they actually have a higher frequency of hypertension risk genetic variants than Africans do, but yet they display lower levels of high blood pressure. So once again, we can't, explain these differences in blood pressure on the basis of genetic differences between these populations. So how do you end up getting high blood pressure? Well, there's a number of ways. One of the ways is constant stress. So people who are oftentimes exposed to difficult life conditions, like poverty, like, constant insults because of the color of their skin, will develop stress responses. And part of those stress responses will result in high blood pressure. So once again, you can tell the story of how high blood pressure is a genetic characteristic of Africans, and again, it's simply not true. It is, again, a response to the conditions in which oppressed people of African descent live in the Western Hemisphere, because we see the exact same genetic composition of people in West Africa and Central Africa, and we do not see high blood pressure.
How can professional training and or biomedical research be a remedy for the problems you're describing?
Well, first and foremost, most of the people who are being trained in medical school are not being exposed to 21st century understanding of human genetic variation. Now, you would think that this shouldn't be allowed. In other words, since individuals differ genetically, you would think that that training in modern population and evolutionary genetics would be part of the curriculum that is experienced by medical students. And it turns out in most medical programs that is simply not true. Neither are courses in genetics, in evolutionary genetics, population genetics required in undergraduates who are applying to medical programs. So there are very few questions, for example, on the medical college admissions test that address is a student's understanding of human genetic variation and population genetics. Now, I have worked with colleagues to redress that. In other words, to get the medical college admissions test assessing what students know about population genetics, also to get professional training exams redone so that they don't reinforce racial misconceptions, and again, test what physicians actually understand about human genetic variation and how that is associated with health and also social determinants of health. So this work is ongoing as we speak. And to give you an example of that, there was a report that was generated by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine 2 years ago that examines and explains to folks how modern genomics and population descriptors should be utilized in both biomedical research and clinical practice. In addition to that, I and a colleague of mine have given over 100 grand round lectures to leading medical schools in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom on this very subject. So in the last 3 years, we've spoken to literally thousands of physicians at premier medical programs. I have just finished a book with colleagues at Oxford University entitled Anti-Racist Medicine, which will be published by Elsevier Press, one of the largest scientific publishers in the world, in June of 2026, in which we describe all of these racial misconceptions and how they should not be part of clinical training or clinical practice. So the answer to that is we are working to undo these century-held misconceptions about human biological variation and the concept of race. But we have now run into a brick wall with the changes that are being forced on medical schools by the new Trump administration and its attack on what they consider to be woke curriculum. And in fact, what we've been trying to do is to introduce the best and most recent science of human biological variation into the curriculum. And they're attacking it as being political, when in fact, what we're trying to do is improve the way physicians are trained so that their clinical that's not really the wrong word. So their clinical practice will benefit everyone instead of just someone's.
Well, Joseph L. Graves Jr., Mackenzie Scott Endowed Professor of Biology at North Carolina A&T, author of the book, Why Black People Die Sooner. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Well, thank you so much for having me today, and all the best going forward.
Ditto.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Bernadette Ludwig. Thank you, Dr. Joseph Graves Jr. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon. Thank you to our board op, Sylvester, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our brother Dino coming up next with The Signal. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.